This Russian serial killer had a lot of names. The Butcher of Rostov, the Rostov Ripper, the Red Ripper. He was a sexually motivated serial killer who assaulted, murdered, and mutilated a minimum of 52 women and children for the 12 years between 1978 and 1990 in Soviet era Russia. He operated in a broad area that is now composed of Russia, the Ukraine, and Uzbekistan, but most of his murders were committed in Rostov Oblast, here in what is modern day Russia. His official number of killings is 43, according to the Supreme Court of Russia, though he would confess to 56. Growing up was rough for Chikatilo, who was born in Yablukny in what is now Ukraine. When he was born, his region was suffering a famine caused by Stalin's agricultural policies. The family lived in a one-room hut but made no money as collective farm laborers. Instead, the way it worked was they worked on the collective all day, and in exchange they were allowed to grow some food for themselves on a small lot of land adjacent to their hut. You can imagine that meant that the family hardly ever had enough food for themselves. Chikatilo said they had bread and would eat grass and leaves to prevent starvation. His mother would try to provide some sort of comfort by telling him that before he was born, neighbors took his older brothers, Stephen, just 4, and ate him because they were starving. Her tale can't be verified, but it may be true. During the Great Famine, millions of people died, and many did resort to cannibalism. War and conflict would also be a part of his childhood, along with the hunger and poverty. He witnessed the Nazi occupation of Ukraine, and his father was a prisoner of war. He spent much of the occupation hiding in cellars and ditches with his mother. The stress would cause Chikatilo to wet the one bed he shared with his mother, and she would beat him for it. His mother was probably raped in front of him, giving birth to a daughter later. Their little hut was burned to the ground, and he was too weak and hungry to attend school regularly. As he grew older, he suffered from impotence in normal relationships. It wouldn't be diagnosed until much later, but Chikatilo likely suffered from hydrocephalus at birth. This probably also partially caused his bedwetting and his later impotence. When his father finally returned from the prison camp, he was treated as a traitor for allowing himself to be captured, and that only added to the bullying Chikatilo experienced at school. So yeah, pretty rough. But millions of other children faced similar conditions during the war years, and few of them turned into the monster Chikatilo would become. After doing a number of jobs and completing his compulsory military service and taking some training, Chikatilo became a Russian language teacher in 1930, and he worked at a boarding school. That's when things started becoming very concerning. He committed his first known sexual assault in May 1973 on one of his students, a 15-year-old girl that he groped. So he struggled, and that made him, well, let's say less impotent. A few months later, he locked another teenage girl in his classroom, beat her, and sexually assaulted her. Unbelievably, there were no consequences for either attack. He also wasn't punished for spanking his flaccid monkey in front of students. It was just allowed to happen. That is until there were enough complaints that the director of the school finally told him, resign or be fired. He left and went to work at another school, because of course he was allowed to do that. He worked there for 4.5 years until staff cutbacks got him. He moved to another school in a coal mining town 47 miles north of Rostov. He started hanging around public toilets where he spied on young girls. He would buy chewing gum to give to female kids to try and earn their trust. He sexually assaulted at least 3 girls using the gum enticement. By 1981, he was done teaching. There had just been far too many complaints about child molestation by then of boys and of girls. He went to work in a factory in a job that, unfortunately for many women and children and for the authorities, required him to travel. But let's go back a little in time because Chikatilo began killing while he was still a teacher. In December 1978, he lured little 9-year-old Yelena Sokotnova to a hut and tried to rape her, but he couldn't get his member to work. The girl struggled with him, though. He choked her and he stabbed her, and that caused him to get off. He tossed the girl into the Rostov River, where her body would be found a few days later. All kinds of evidence should have led police to Chikatilo for this murder. There was blood in the snow near his fence. Neighbors saw him in that little hut. The child's backpack was found at the end of his street, and a witness described a man looking just like Chikatilo talking to the child at a bus stop where she was last seen alive. Chikatilo's wife would also provide him a false but strong, in the eyes of police, alibi. They arrested a 25-year-old laborer instead who had a prior murder conviction. The laborer had a strong alibi, but arrested and bullied into a confession he was. He was convicted and sentenced to death, but would end up serving 15 years instead. The child's family was outraged, so they tried and convicted him again, and this time he was wrongly executed in July 1983. After killing little Yelena, Chikatilo was done with fighting off urges he had to hurt women and children to achieve his gratification. He wouldn't kill again, as far as we can prove, for a few years, but he wasn't going to hold back on those urges either. In September 1981, Chikatilo met 17-year-old Larissa Tchenko at a bus stop at the Rostov city center. He lured her into the forest at the Don River by promising her they would have a drink of vodka and relax. He found a secluded area, threw the girl to the ground, and tried to rape her. Again, his anatomy failed him, so he grabbed handfuls of mud and stuffed it into her mouth, gagging her before he beat her and strangled her to death. He mutilated her with his teeth and with a stick. He would cover her loosely with newspaper, branches, and leaves, and then he left. She was found the next day. He traveled to Rostov again in June 1982 by bus. He had to change buses at Donskoy, which is a small village, and he decided to walk the rest of the way. He ran into Lyubov Beryuk, who was 13, who was on her way back to her house from shopping. They walked together for a little while until Chikatilo found a spot thick with bushes where no witnesses could see. He then attacked the girl and dragged her into the undergrowth. He tore off her dress and stabbed her to death. She would be found more than 2 weeks later, having suffered 22 different knife wounds on the body and more on her head. He would take 5 more lives in similar ways that summer. They were all between the ages of 9 and 18. Beginning with little Lyubov, he would also stab at the eye sockets of his victims. That became part of his MO. He continued in this way with girls and boys and women, killing 10-year-old Olga Stelmachnikov in December 1982. It was just before this killing that police began to link some of the victims to the same killer. A team of police from Moscow would be sent to Rostov to investigate the 4 cases they believed were linked. A forensic analyst was assigned to the cases as well. When the analyst examined Olga's little body, the knife marks in her eyes left him no doubt that there was a serial killer at work. Chikatilo backed off slightly then, and he waited until the following summer, June 1983, to kill again, as far as we know. This time it was 15-year-old Laura Sarkeesian. Her body was found near a railway station. This would be the beginning of clues that would eventually bring Chikatilo's end. Again, during these summer months, Chikatilo took 5 more victims. All were left with similar mutilations. It was now crystal clear for police and for prosecutors that a serial killer had taken all 6 of these victims, and it was likely the same serial killer that took victims from the year before. Police had a lot of theories about who would do this: a satanic cult, organ harvesters, a pedophile, or someone seriously mentally ill. They checked on the whereabouts and the goings-on of anyone in the area who spent time in a psychiatric ward, along with everyone who had a conviction for pedophilia or homosexuality, which was a very deviant crime in Soviet Russia. Each of these people was put into a card filing system. They then added all of the sex offenders. They went through the cards one by one, eliminating those with strong alibis. Now, it's still Russia, so it should not surprise anyone that by September 1983, a group of intellectually disabled young men began to confess to the murders. They were subjected to long and brutal interrogations, after all, by a task force that was pressured to produce the serial killer for justice. For the community, the writing was on the wall. 3 homosexual men and a convicted sex offender all committed suicide. Brutal tactics or not, the task force cleared more than 1,000 criminal files during their investigation, completely unrelated to Chikatilo's crimes. There were 95 murders cleared, 140 aggravated assaults, and 245 rapes, all solved, as far as the Russian authorities were concerned anyway. Back to the false confessions. The investigators would notice one big problem with them. They would get a confession and jail a suspect, and women and children would still turn up dead. Obviously, they were not getting their man. In October 1983, Vera Shakin, a 19-year-old prostitute, was found in Shakhty. In December, a 14-year-old boy, Sergei Markov, was lured off a train and murdered near a train station near Novocherkassk, again with the trains. The police investigators had a difficult task on their hands, no doubt. The next 2 murders, both women, would occur in Rostov, in the same park. We'll see of Chikatilo. The next, in March 1984, was a 10-year-old boy, Dmitry Patashnikov. He left witnesses to this one, though, who gave police this composite. He also left a footprint and bloody fluid samples and body fluid, semen and saliva behind. In May, he was back in Shakhty and killed Tatiana Petrosian and her daughter, Svetlana, who was only 10 years old. Unlike most of his victims, Tatiana had known Chikatilo for years before he killed her. And he would take 4 more victims just that July. That summer, though, he would switch jobs after being accused of theft. That hardly interrupted his murder spree. Back at the Rostov Park of Aviators, he killed Natalia Voloskaya, 16, then Ludmila Alexeyeva, 17, both near the Don River. Right after killing Ludmila, he got on a flight and went to what is now Uzbekistan. He killed 2 people there, a woman and a girl. Then there was Alexander Chapel, 11, at the Don River, in nearly the same spot where he killed Ludmila. He was practically begging to be caught at this point. He went back to the Park of Aviators again and killed Irina Lutinskaya, 24. By 1984, there were undercover detectives all over the rail and bus stations. Police had made the connection that the serial killer they were looking for was a traveler. In September 1984, Chikatilo was seen by two detectives trying to talk to a young woman at a bus station in Rostov. They followed him and watched him try to talk to women and rubbing himself against them. He was arrested at the Central Market. He was searched at that point, and police found a knife, lengths of rope, and a jar of petroleum jelly on him. He was held on that allegation of theft by his previous employer. Investigators would note his resemblance to witness descriptions and that composite and take a sample of Chikatilo's blood. And this is where the investigation went askew a little. Again, they analyzed his blood as type A, but they had analyzed semen samples from 6 of the victims as type AB. They filed Chikatilo's information away on one of their cards, and he was sent to prison for a year for the theft. He served 3 months. By the time he was released, prosecutors working the case had linked 23 of the deaths together and dropped all charges against the disabled youths who had confessed. His arrest likely shook him a little bit because he didn't kill again for nearly a year, that we know of, when he killed Natalia Kolostova while on a trip to Moscow. She was killed near the airport, so investigators were looking for someone who was flying. Chikatilo, however, had traveled to Moscow by train. He killed Irina Gulyeva on August 27, 1985, in Shakhty. The military began patrolling rail stations. Undercover female officers were set out to bait the killer. A special prosecutor was appointed. Several curators were assigned to keep track of all the details of the investigation. You can imagine by now the information they had was just massive and a lot. The number of detectives went from 10 to 29. A psychiatrist was also brought in, and this would be Russia's very first serial killer profile. The profiler, well, he got it bang on with his profile, bang on. In the meantime, Chikatilo tried to cool it. Reports were beginning to appear in the media, and so he backed off for a while. But by August 1986, he was killing again. This time, Irina Pogorilova, 18, was killed. Chikatilo would try to bury her to avoid detection. He only killed the one victim, as far as we know, in 1986. But he would kill 3 more victims, a woman and 2 boys, in the spring and summer of 1988, and 5 more in February and in the summer months of 1989. He tried to change up his modus operandi a little in these murders, dismembering one and dumping her in a sewer, for example. Though struggling, investigators finally linked most of the murders to the railway stations, and so they would focus their surveillance on those. They put hidden cameras on trains and assigned plainclothes officers to film and photograph passengers all through Rostov. But he would take his next victim, an 11-year-old boy, from a theater. And he managed, despite all that surveillance, to take a 10-year-old boy from a train station in Rostov and kill him at the Botanical Gardens. Both were taken in the winter months, which was another change in his MO. By August 1990, another 3 victims were killed, a woman and 2 boys. 2 of those taken from near train stations. What police did next was a little genius, creativity born of desperation, rather. They chose the one rail line through Rostov where most of the victims were found near or taken from. They called on massive police resources and filled the larger stations with police officers in uniform. Those were harder to patrol because of the sheer number of people who were using those stations. The uniformed officers, they hoped, would dissuade their mark from trying to hunt there. Hopefully, the killer would believe the smaller stations without any uniformed officers were safer targets. At the smaller stations, plainclothes officers would just be plastered everywhere. An adult, any adults, in the company of any young woman or child, was stopped and his name and passport information were recorded. There were only 2 more killings because, well, the plan worked. The first of the killings took place near one of the larger stations. The next, Svetlana Krostik, 22, was taken and killed from Donisklov station, and an undercover officer would spot Chikatilo using a well to wash his hands and his face. He had grass and dirt stains on his elbows, a blood smear on his cheek, and a wound on one of his fingers. Coming out of the woods in a suit, carrying a sports bag, was also just a little sus. His papers were checked, but he was not arrested, not just yet. Being sus wasn't good enough, for they had not yet found Svetlana. Her body would not be found for a full week. Police would thoroughly check the records for that station once Svetlana was found, and boom, there it was, Chikatilo. They checked on his movements with his employers and were able to match his travel to the bodies. And those early assaults on students that were kept hush-hush, well, not anymore. As they looked into Chikatilo's life, he lined right up with what that criminal profile said. Checkbox by checkbox. Intense surveillance of Chikatilo began on November 14, 1990. They watched as he approached and talked to women and children. On the 20th, he filled a jar with beer, went to a park, and tried to make contact with children. Before he could do anything to any of them, he was arrested, cuffed, and put in a police car. They placed an informant in his cell and began interrogating him over the next several days. This time, instead of just a blood test, they took a semen sample as well. It was AB. It is entirely possible, though rare, that blood types and even DNA can differ in different organs of the body. Chikatilo had the same rare condition that causes that, and it's called chimerism. They only had 10 days to question him before they had to let him go. So on day 9, without much success in breaking him, they brought in the profiler who had been so accurate in predicting Chikatilo's traits. The psychiatrist sat down and he read parts of the profile to Chikatilo, and that's what broke the man. Finally, they had their man, and they had their confession. Chikatilo would spend an entire day confessing his sins, all of them, even those that police knew nothing about. He was charged, and now he could be helped. He gave a consistent confession, drawing sketches of each crime scene. He would try in vain to minimize the murders by claiming the victims were all substandard people, low-class types. He would explain that he had slashed and stabbed or gouged the eyes because he believed in a superstition that his image would be burned into the eyes of his victims. It was only after he stopped believing that superstition that he stopped doing that. He would also confess to cannibalizing parts of his victims. He would then lead police to a number of victims that they had not found, confessing to each of those murders. The trial was wild, and one of the first open to the media after Glasnost. Chikatilo often yelled over the judge and frequently exposed himself. He would dismiss some questions and fully cooperate with others. Eventually, his lawyer grew tired and began yelling at the judge as well. The judge paid no heed and dismissed the prosecutor, continuing the trial with no prosecutor at all until the state went ahead and sent a new one. Wild, just wild. But ultimately, Chikatilo's disruptive tactics failed, and he was convicted of 52 of the 53 murders he was charged with. He was sentenced to death on each of those convictions. He was also sentenced to 86 years for a number of sexual assaults. That enraged Chikatilo, who again began shouting at the judge. To be fair to Chikatilo, as much as you could be, and his defense lawyer, the judge did have an obvious bias and failed to be impartial at all. If the man were tried by the standards of the West, he would have received a new trial just based on the judge's behavior alone. But he wasn't tried in the West. He was tried in Russia. He would appeal, and the appeal was rejected, though the Supreme Court of Russia would say there wasn't enough evidence on 9 of those murder charges. In actuality, his appeal would not change his death sentence, since it was handed down on 43 of the other charges. He applied for clemency to Boris Yeltsin, and that was also denied, as you can imagine. He was executed on Valentine's Day 1994 and buried in an unmarked grave. The police investigators and the prosecutors were heavily criticized for mistakes in their investigation of the case, including a failure to send out warnings to the public that a serial killer might be on the loose, and for gaps in the surveillance of Chikatilo. To be fair to the police, the blood chimerism issue is not something that most investigative services were aware of. The press, prior to Glasnost, was very limited in what they could tell the public about anything. And there was suppression by the government of any suggestion that a communist nation could produce a serial killer. Glasnost and the resulting loosening of control over the media only happened in 1986. They also had the gold standard of a criminal profile in their hands. And I do mean gold. That thing was so accurate. The problem with this is that the effectiveness of the profile was, for some time, obfuscated by that chimeric blood test. It's something that the analyst, the profiler, could never have imagined. Thanks for listening. If you're enjoying these videos and want more, don't forget to subscribe and turn on your notifications so that you don't miss any videos. Thank you for watching. We really appreciate it.